Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Gwen Keys Fleming, and it is my distinct honor and privilege to be your moderator today for this panel sponsored by the ABA's section on criminal rights and social justice. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here as we talk about environmental justice, economic justice, how that relates to some of the other social concerns of voting and other things. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank our sponsors, the leaders at CRSJ. So thank you so much for having us today. And I guess we'll get right into it. So for our panel this morning, we have, again, I hope you appreciate, you've got like the folks that started really delving into the academics of the environmental justice movement, the folks that carried the mantle, picked up the mantle, carried it to enforce early on in DOJ. You've got the folks that are tied closely to the community. So you'll get to hear that voice in the room today. And then obviously you've got a representative, Marian Engelman-Lotto, who is joining us virtually. There she is. Hello, good morning. And so let me take the time to introduce them properly for you. So first, Dr. Margot Brown is the Vice President of Justice and Equity for the Environmental Defense Fund. Dr. Brown. You have Marian Engelman-Lotto, the Acting Principal Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the U.S. Protection Agency. You have Mr. Charles Lee, who is the Senior Advisor in the Office of Environmental Justice at the Environmental Protection Agency. And then you have Mr. Quentin Pear, who's an adjunct professor at Howard University School of Law. He serves with me as the co-chair of the American Bar Association's Task Force on Environmental Justice, and he is a former senior attorney in the Department of Justice prosecuting environmental cases, as well as their former environmental justice lead. And we'll talk a little bit about how DOJ has progressed in the last several days and weeks and months. So let's start off. We wanted to level set a little bit. And so we thought we'd start at a place with the definition of environmental justice. And we realize when you talk about environmental justice, it's not just a federal issue. You're going to be hearing from folks across the spectrum, and we can talk about what that means a little bit. And as I am going forward, I realized I didn't introduce myself. So forgive me for that. I was just like, they're the experts. We want to hear from them. But my name is Gwen Keys Fleming. I serve as the co-chair and a partner at DLA Piper and a co-chair of their environmental practice here in the United States. I've been dealing with, or had the opportunity to work with various communities of color in the EJ space pretty much since 2010. And so now I get to do that in my private sector life, helping companies understand the importance of being true to this work. So going back to the definition, and we're going to use EPA's definition because I think it's a unifying one, but I also do want to recognize that some states and other localities have different definitions, but let's level set from the beginning. So per EPA, environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. And so when we talk about this, there are two key parts of that definition: fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And I just want to go on a little bit further so we can understand how, when we talk about environmental justice communities and disparate impacts, how that comes out of this definition. So specifically with respect to fair treatment, that means that no group of people should bear a disproportionate share of the negative environmental consequences resulting from industrial, government, and commercial activities or policies. When you talk about meaningful involvement, it's important to realize that this means that communities and people have an opportunity to participate in the decisions about activities that affect their lives, their environment, or their health, that public's contribution can influence the action, whether it's regulatory or any action if a company is making the decision, and that the community concerns will be considered in the decision-making process. It's also important that decision makers proactively seek out and facilitate the engagement and the discussion going on. So with that frame of where we are today with EPA's definition, I want to begin our panel with hearing from Charles Lee to give us kind of the historic perspective about how we got here. He will be followed by Quentin Pear to talk about some of the enforcement aspects and how that has been used as a tool historically. Of course, I think it's very important to hear from the community. You'll hear me say that more often than once today. And so then we'll hear from Margot or Dr. Brown. I want to make sure I put respect on her name. And then last but not least, we'll bring it to the fore. We'll hear from Marian Engelman-Lotto to talk about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing. So we'll start off with just some opening thoughts and remarks, and then we'll get into a little bit of conversation. We encourage you as the audience to either write down questions, or we'll get to a dedicated portion where we can hear from you as well. Okay, so Charles, why don't you start us off?
Thank you, Gwen. Is this on? Thank you, Gwen. And just let me say it's really a pleasure to be here this morning, to be part of this panel, and to talk about this an issue that has whose time has really come. So let me start by saying how amazing it is to think back to a time when we were working on an issue that didn't even have a name. So when I started to work on the nexus between race, poverty, environment, some more than 40 years ago, that the idea that people of color, indigenous, Native American, low-income communities will be disproportionately impacted by environmental pollution didn't have a name. People didn't know how to think about it. And for me, I started to think about these issues in the late 1970s, but it wasn't until the historic protests in Warren County, North Carolina in 1982, where residents protested the siting of a hazardous waste landfill there in that predominantly Black and poor county, that I saw the transformative potential of this set of issues. I had gone there to show solidarity for the protesters, and I will say that I think, in retrospect, when people talk about environmental justice being the civil rights issue of the 21st century, back in 1982, Warren County was just an example of the convergence of two great social movements of the latter half of the 20th century, which was environmentalism and civil rights. So from there, I was fortunate to work for the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ, which was the faith-based civil rights agency. And I started to work on this issue by going around the country and researching this idea that there was of issues of race, poverty, and environment, and I was just completely overwhelmed by the fact that how pervasive the issue it is. And I don't think I even have the time today just to go through all these examples that come up, everything from farm workers to pesticides to dumping on native lands, to the fact that the largest chemical waste landfill in the country was in the Alabama Black Belt, in Mia, Alabama. And I was thinking about how to put this issue, to really bring this issue to national attention. And shortly after Warren County, in 1983, the Governmental Accountability Office did a study of 4 off-site hazardous waste landfills in EPA Region 4. I thought that maybe replicating that study would be a great way to kind of put this issue on the map. And that resulted in what is now the landmark Toxic Waste and Race report. Um, and that report, among other things, showed that race was in fact the factor that was most able to predict the location of hazardous waste sites. That sparked a lot of interest in academia, leading to at the University of Michigan, the first national conference, academic conference on race and the incidence of environmental hazards that was organized by Professors Bunyan Bryant and Paul Mohai. I do want to reflect on what has happened since then, because now we see the fact that perhaps thousands, I would say, peer-reviewed journal articles have been written about all aspects of environmental injustice. That there are hundreds of university courses on the subject. There is even, in fact, a PhD program on environmental justice. So the other, I think, another strand to think about in terms of what happened was what happened at the grassroots, and I think this is probably most important because this is what was the engine that drives us to what environmental justice is today. One of the things that I got from after the publication of Toxic Waste and Race was all these people from all these communities from across the country calling and saying, "Hey, you know what? I have environmental issues in my community, and heretofore they couldn't connect it with issues of race." And now that they could, they had a really powerful way of talking about it and advocating and organizing around it. I think that so the other important piece that, in terms of a thread of history, was how when we saw all this activity at the grassroots, that it was important to coalesce a national movement on environmental justice. And we brought together in 1991 in the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, some 1,100 peoples from across the country to in fact to showcase the fact that this is an issue that in which people of color was in spite of what people think, that this is an issue where people of color was actually doing a lot of organizing around, and in fact that this was something that had that can show real leadership to the country in terms of a very important set of issues. So a set of principles of environmental justice was codified, and a call to action to organize strong grassroots community-based organizations and regional networks was issued. There is a direct connection between that and what is happening today in terms of the activities, the commitments of the Biden-Harris administration to environmental justice came about as a result of many of the people that were participated in that event back in 1991. Of course, the federal government in the early 90s began to take this issue up in terms of an Office of Environmental Equity. In 1992, the establishment of a National Environmental Justice Advisory Council, an executive order issued by President Clinton. And these are still here today and continue to add to the body of work that upon which we build. So let me just stop here and say, and kind of reflect and say that environmental justice now has an arc of history that speaks to very important shifts in how the nation looks at environmental protection, health, and sustainability. It should be noted that when we sent toxic waste and race to the EPA in 1987, the response was that EPA deals with issues of technology, not sociology. Today, we have begun to come full circle. It is now an undisputed statistical fact that people of color, indigenous, and low-income communities are disproportionately burdened by pollution, health, climate, and other stressors. We now have an increasingly sophisticated understanding of how the natural, built, and social environments interact to result in to produce devastating health consequences. We know that historical and structural factors like redlining, and there is evidence of this, drive the concentration of environmental burdens. We have learned that we cannot achieve workable solutions to the climate crisis without addressing the needs of overburdened and marginalized communities. We know that providing resources to correct historic wrongs is going to have to take new approaches that build on community strategies for achieving their own vision. We are beginning to think about how to address multiple and cumulative impacts in environmental decision making. And we finally have embraced the importance of using civil rights laws to address discrimination and inequity in the environmental sphere. Because of all these developments in the past 40 years that I briefly talked about, we are now equipped to take advantage of what is a truly historic and unprecedented and exciting time for environmental justice. And Marion will go into that later, but I will end by asking all of you to join us in advancing an exciting piece of time work this era of transformative change for environmental justice and civil rights.
Thanks, Charles. I hope the room recognizes that what Charles hoped to manifest in terms of bringing national attention to the issue of environmental justice has certainly happened. And we have a lot of work to do still, but thank you for having that vision, that dream on behalf of so many communities that really, really needed it. So now let's talk about, or as you might imagine, EPA at the time was not the only one that was focused on environmental justice. President Clinton issued his executive order 12898 in 1994, I believe it was, and that brought the beginning of a whole of government approach to the benefit of communities. And one key part of that was the Department of Justice. And so as the order came down, Mr. Quentin Pear was the senior attorney in the Department of Justice, Environmental and Natural Resources Division. And so Quentin, why don't you tell us a little bit about how you came to this space and the tools that you were able to deploy from the Department of Justice to benefit communities?
Let's start off by apologizing for maybe stepping on Charles' toes a little bit, but since he's been my mentor, environmental justice, I think he'll forgive me a little bit. I'm going to start by repeating what Charles said, particularly for this audience. Thank you. Environmental justice is the civil rights of the 21st century. Didn't know that 25 years ago when I was busy doing Superfund cases, Love Canal, all this, these bid litigations and environmental law. But one day I said, you know, I need a little break. I want to do something different. So I saw this detail advertised on what was something new. I think they called it a computer. It was a little screen that sat on my desk. And it said EPA was looking for a detail or environmental justice. Didn't know what the hell environmental justice was. All I know is I'd be going someplace different, away from all these crazy lawyers. Little did I know. First day I got there, I read this thing called Executive Order 12898 because I didn't have anything else to do. The second day, the director of the office took me to a meeting and told the assistant administrators who were really upset because someone had said they couldn't have this deal on a $200 million project down in Virginia that the state and EPA had been working on for 15 years. And he said because it didn't comply with Executive Order 12898. And our attorney from the Department of Justice, Mr. Pear, will explain why. And I did not have those long lunches that I thought I was going to have or naps at my desk, and I hit the ground running and haven't stopped since. I came back to DOJ proselytizing about environmental justice, and people smiled and said, well, you know, we really don't do charity work here, which is what this is. And that's some policy statements, but you know, the next administration will come along. And then when the Bush administration came along and they had to say, everybody said, well, you know, executive orders, that all the next the president does is just rescind it with the stroke of a pen. That was what, 5 administrations ago? Oh, you know, environmental justice, it's just an executive order. It's not a law. So you're really not going to get anything done. I cannot tell you how much has been done on the Executive Order 12898. And I will tell you this, in the federal government, there would be no environmental justice but for Charles Lee. Charles came out of working in the vineyards. He was one of the organizers of the movement. There's no one person that gets credit for environmental justice. Charles is one of those that comes pretty damn close. Okay, he made it happen. There's this thing called the Federal Interagency Working Group on Environmental Justice, where we had about 14 federal agencies under the order, which was signed by President Clinton in '94. It said, come together and figure out how to help these underserved communities. Now, let me be clear about underserved communities. We're talking about people of color and the poor. And you must understand that environmental injustices have been ubiquitous in this country since its inception, if not before. And the proof has been in the last 10, 15 years, you can't open up a paper or go on TV and not see the statistics. People of color have less access to health care. They're the first ones to go to jail and prison, the first ones to get shot by the police, housing, discrimination. You can go down the list. It's just an embarrassment, to tell you the truth. And central to this is understanding that this is systemic racism, which no one likes to say or talk about. But that is the bottom of environmental justice. And we haven't done anything about it. Not enough. I shouldn't say anything because that's not true. When I start off with that EPA, it was very hard to convince the people at EPA that this was important. I had to explain to them, you know, the executive order is a directive from your boss, the President of the United States. Remember him? We haven't had a hurry yet. So. They said, oh, yeah, this is what he wants you to do. And it's been the building of this agency after agency and after agency that we have gotten to the point we have laid the foundation for someone like something like the Biden administration to come along and really make this work. Okay, now look, I'm an independent. Okay, I'm not a Democrat, not a Republican. I'm big on this president and this administration. I don't agree with everything. But the one thing I do agree on, what he and this administration, and he's made it very clear, everybody in the government, you better get on board because this is a whole of government approach. Because that's the only way you can address these injustices. He hit the ground running in the first, a week of another executive order. Did not erase 12898. Executive Order 14008, which basically said you had to do everything in your power to fix this. Okay, he called it out for what it is. It's systemic racism. And each agency was instructed to do everything within its authority to address this. And I said, I have to use a legal term here, so forgive me. Damn. People have talked a big game, okay? Very appreciative to President Clinton, who signed the Executive Order 128. That was not a government executive order. I mean, it was. Do you know who put it together? Charles Lee and the other movements of the people in the movement who came to the White House and said, here. And the Clinton administration put it into, bureaucratic language and put a few paragraphs and titles on it all. But it is a product of the people. Okay? This is not some idea that Quentin Pierce sat down in his little cubicle. Let me make up something real quick. And then it was like the work that Charles had us do on the IWG. I remember meeting with Charles and maybe 2 or 3 other representatives, hardcore environmental justice advocates. And one day when the Obama administration came along, I walked in, they were going to have they're preparing for a meeting with President Obama and grassroots organizations and people. And they wanted it to go well, of course. So I walked in this room bigger than this room, filled with people, supposedly working on environmental justice. And we went around the room doing it. I did not know we had that many agencies in the federal government. We had people from the White House, the Domestic Policy Council, Small Business Administration. I said, where are these people? They came around the room and I said, I want to thank the people who organized this, how impressed I was. And I said, but you know what? I don't know any of you people. And if I don't know you, that means you haven't been doing anything in environmental justice. You better go back and find the people in your organizations who have been working on it for the last 10 years. If you do not want your president or your secretaries to be embarrassed, because they will be, because you don't know what you're doing. And I was still fortunate enough to keep my job, but that's a whole nother story. I got friends. But seriously, it's been a building up in the agencies of people who have wanted to work on environmental justice, who worked in the IWG and had to learn what it was. And how did they learn? Because Charles made us go into communities and sit down with people in the organization and have fried chicken dinner in their kitchen. Okay? If you can't talk with the people, you can't help the people. This went on for years. And Obama is still my president, even though I'm an independent. But you know what? He was quiet at the top. We sent recommendations up about what to do and to bolster environmental justice. This administration has taken environmental justice and brought it into the White House. It moved the IWG up into the White House Council on Interagency Council on Environmental Justice. It created the White House Advisory Council on Environmental Justice, all of grassroots community people, not business, not academia, not others, for the advice and counsel directly to the President of the United States. So you know what? He's stuck with this. He's owning it. And the grassroots people can yell in his ear and not in my ear and tell me to take it to my boss, who takes it to her boss, etc. Till it maybe gets to the White House. That's big. That's big. Take a look at Executive Order 12898, but also 14008, and see all that's in there, including Justice 40, which I believe Marion's going to talk about the money that's being dedicated to environmental justice. Unbelievable. And it's still not enough, but it's a good start. So now, what I'm trying to say briefly is, this just didn't happen. God bless the President Biden and all of the people working with him, but they don't get credit for starting this. This comes out of the grassroots organization, leaders like Charles. Charles is not the only one. There are a whole lot of other people that deserve credit. But people have been tilling for 20, 30, 40 years to reach this point, so now we can have an administration that has the foundation and support to do something. Which leads me to my favorite subject, the Department of Justice. You know, it was about halfway through. I did 35 years of doing prosecuting cases criminally and civilly as a senior litigator. And as I said, I got tired one night. I went over to the EPA on this detail, came back, and we wound up in putting environmental justice into how do you prepare a case? How do you sue people? And what is environmental justice? Because it's not a law. I can't sue anybody for violating environmental justice law, but it's a lens. When you look through that lens, when I see that a company has been polluting a community, first thing I look at is, okay, what are the demographics? Because they're only really, I'll be quite frankly, the only two populations I'm really concerned with, people of color and the poor. Why? Because they've been crapped on all through history in law and in fact by the federal government, by the laws that have been passed by the government, state, federal and state, as well as the private sector of this country. And it has to be corrected. But these two populations don't have a voice and they don't have the muscle that they need. So people like us who work in environmental justice try to give them a little bit of muscle. But anyway, so I sat down and read the Executive Order 14008, and in it, it says, I mean, the Attorney General is directed to make this the first priority of business for the Department of Justice. Okay? Now, I listened to what the Attorney General said because that was my paycheck. But that was never been done before. I look back very fondly on the years I had at DOJ. Wasn't always good. We had racism in the Department of Justice. That's why I became the chair of the Black Lawyers Association in the Department of Justice to confront it directly. Okay? Did not agree with many things that were done, but I look back with great appreciation for my career there. And it got things done. What we did, we started publishing cases that had settlements and the results of cases that had environmental justice issues so people could see. We gave training, mandatory training to lawyers doing litigation. You didn't take the environmental justice training, you didn't do litigation, or you got fired. Well, we didn't fire anybody. But change was coming. And then I would get the people, how do you do this? I mean, we have to write a report up to the assistant administrator, assistant, who is he? Thank you. Assistant, that's a damn shit. Assistant Attorney General, who would sign off on cases. And they'd sent them to me because I was the guru on EJ. And these lawyers would tell me, well, this is what I think we need to do. And I said, well, why you come to me? You know what you're doing. And it was the younger lawyers that got it before the older lawyers came near it. Because the older lawyers will look at numbers. How much money did you get in penalties on that case? Were you on such and such a case, that big case? The younger lawyers was about, well, how do I fix this problem for these poor people whose children are dying in the streets, in the hospitals? And they said, you sure Quentin's is all right? I said, get out of my office and go back and write up their report for the, and it came naturally to them. Now, in the executive order, I can be up here all day talking this stuff, so I'm just going to hit on a couple of notes that I have. the executive order, you just go online to the US DOJ, Office of Environmental Justice, and you can see on one page, you have 4 principles for what has to be done. First one is prioritizing cases for environmental justice issues. Okay, those are the first one. And they have to be there, the top priority. Do not, in cases that we're going to go and sue people on and make them do something. There is an environmental justice steering committee with the top people in in DOJ that sit on the case. It's not just some little gratuitous policy that was done downstairs, because no one before looked at this stuff beyond the Assistant Attorney General. Now he's the grunt in the group. Okay, they created the Office of Environmental Justice, which I worked on for years with people, with the present director, Cynthia Ferguson, who was, if they hadn't made her the director, I was going to chain myself to the front gate. Because there are very few people who have the experience of a litigator, understands the culture of the Department of Justice, and is respected by the community. And at the bottom of the well of environmental justice, if you don't have respect and trust, you are SOL. Okay? So, I mean, it's all laid down there in English about all the things that the Attorney General says he wants done and has to be done with annual reports and regular meetings, and not just meetings. If you go online, you'll also find some of the things, particularly redlining, which is going to be talked about more here, and the cases that are being brought now. All of a sudden, cases are being brought. The largest one was in November. We had a $31 million penalty for a bank for indulging that have been exploiting people with a red line. That's a whole history. There are about 3 or 4 that I had somewhere in my notes that we've been doing. The question I have is, why weren't we doing this earlier? Why weren't we doing this in prior administration? You mean people's health wasn't more important than the size of the penalty that you brought in for the Department of Justice and for your career? What's up with that?
It's a good question.
So, I'm told I've said too enough.
You got to know, I love this man. We have a little.
Gwen keeps me in line and co-chairs on this ABA task force on environmental justice, which we've been asked, no problem, to explain how the ABA needs to get jiggy with it and how they can not only get educated, but how they're going to help and partner in making environmental justice the civil rights of the 21st century.
Yeah.
So
So we'll talk a little bit more about that later, but I do want to make sure, after hearing what the government was doing, both from EPA and the DOJ side, we hear from Margot as she now represents communities. And I do want to kind of talk about the thread, the common thread between all of us. All of us have spent some time in government dealing with these issues. So we're going to talk a little bit later about maybe why we left or what challenges we see. And maybe you could talk about how your transition from government plays into what you do in supporting communities now.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. This is a conversation that is long overdue. I would just like to reiterate what Charles said, and I hope that you get your pens and paper out and write this down, because he is dropping tons of knowledge today. And there was something he said that is paramount. It is an undisputed fact that people of color and low-income communities bear a disproportionate burden of environmental hazards. That's an undisputed fact. It's no longer up for debate, as been shown by this current administration. So how did we get here? What we know is where and how we build our communities will impact the water that people drink, the air that people breathe, and the land that they live on. And again, I'm just going to uplift Charles's work around toxic waste and race in the United States, because that report was the pivotal report that showed that when you are a person of color, it is not by accident that you are located next to a hazardous waste facility. And we got there by racist zoning practices. We got there by redlining, and all of these decisions that were made almost 100 years ago are having a detrimental impact to thousands of communities today, which really leads me to where we have to go now and where we are in this moment, especially with the Biden administration. And there are two things that I hope you take away. And the first thing is that we're not just dealing with environmental justice, we're now dealing with a climate crisis. And those individuals who sit in environmental justice communities are going to be the first and worst hit by the climate crisis. And so climate has become a threat multiplier for these communities. So these folks are fighting two fronts simultaneously. And Quentin said this, and I think it's so important. He said, if you can't help the people if you can't talk to the people. Who are these people? These people are subject matter experts. Let me say that again, because legally, we think about a subject matter expert. We think about somebody like a Dr. Margot Brown, who has her PhD in toxicology. These folks have a PhD in life. It took me 7 years to obtain my PhD. These people have been living in these communities for decades. And so here's what I can tell you about all of the people who live in these communities. Because they are closest to the problem, they are also closest to the solution. Let that sit in. They are closest to the solution because they are the experts. But one of the things that we as sort of classified experts fail to do is, one, we fail to acknowledge their expertise. And the second thing we fail to do is to listen to their expertise, because the solutions reside with them. And this is why I am thrilled with the passage of IRA, because now we're at a place where the government is saying, we're going to listen to these folks. We're going to listen to what they're saying, and we're going to give them the resources that they need to implement the solutions that they know. So right now, I'd like to put up a slide. It's an image that I'd like to share with you. And this image is really interesting because I've got this, what you see here on the side of the screen, where it says like accountability, capacity building, education, etc., optimism. I traveled 6,000 miles to get that image. This past fall, I was in Luxor, Egypt, at a parliamentarian forum. And there were about 300 parliamentarians from around the global south. And that's Africa, India, South America, but primarily Africa and India. And this list here is the same exact list that I hear over and over and over again from communities. I had to take a picture of it, and everybody's like, oh, should we make it fancy? And I said, no, no, no. I need you to leave it just like that. Because in every single conversation I have here in the United States, these terms appear. And to me, I was blown away because I was like, I cannot believe that this was their takeaway after a 2-day symposium. Again, I traveled 6,000 miles to meet with community folks, and they're all saying the same thing. So you know what? We should probably start listening to what they have to say. Because again, they are the subject matter experts. So where I've landed now is, we're sitting here talking about what can I do? What can I do in this moment? You know what you can do? You can act. What does ACT mean? ACT means accountability plus capacity equals transformation. And I'm going to talk about what Quentin just said. It's not just transformation, it's systemic transformation. And one of the things that we have to do when we think about acting and accountability in this moment is we can't just hold the Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at EPA accountable. We have to hold the entire administration and the entire government accountable. And we also have to start holding accountable state and local governments as well. And when that accountability is paired with more than $60 billion from the Biden administration to begin addressing environmental justice, that's going to lead to the transformation that's needed in this space. So in the interest of time, I always end every talk I do with sort of a call to action. What can I do? Well, I've already laid out what you can do to act. But one of the things that I would encourage you all to do, if you have not done it yet, is to read Toxic Waste and Race in the United States. It is the foundation for environmental justice work in the United States. And the good news is you have one of the authors right here. So I'd encourage you at the end of our discussion to, if you have any real questions, to talk to Charles. The second thing I would encourage you to do is to read Executive Order 12898. And then to also read Executive Order 14008. Because these documents serve as the foundation for where we're going. And if you don't have a foundation, it's going to be really hard to hold somebody accountable. So please, I encourage you all to act. Thank you.
Thank you, Margot. So let's turn it over to Marion. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about what the Biden-Harris administration is doing currently? We'd love to hear about the restructuring at EPA. And then I know at some point we'll talk a little bit about how civil rights plays into all of this important work as well.
Thanks so much. And it is such an honor to be on this panel. And I'm so sorry that I could not be with you today in person. Some members of the panel came from government and now are working with communities. I spent time over 3 decades working with communities and have their voices in my ears as I participate in government, which is just an incredible experience. And I get to work with Charles and other just incredible leaders who are within the federal government. Well, I want to build on and reinforce points that Charles and Margot made to start, which is the United States developed as a deeply segregated society through policies of segregation and redlining. And the vestiges of these policies have never been uprooted. My background is in civil rights. And although in the areas of education, which many of us have looked at, for example, where the promise of equal education remains illusory, the Supreme Court in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg held that school authorities had the obligation to eliminate from the public schools all vestiges of state-imposed segregation, segregatory, all vestiges of segregation, state patterns of land use that were related to redlining and segregation were never uprooted. If, for example, areas where communities of color were deemed industrial and polluting facilities were clustered nearby, there was no moment, there was no Supreme Court case that demanded that these zoning laws be withdrawn to address racial inequality. As a result, today, it should be of no surprise that race, color, and national origin, a person's racial and ethnic background, is a predictor, as you've heard, of exposure to pollutants such as particulate matter, and that that segregation and these patterns impact the opportunities and health of people of color, particularly Black and Latino communities and low-income populations, as well as indigenous populations. Today, residential segregation persists, and the zip code in which a person lives is a predictor of their access to clean air, clean water, and a safe place to live, as you've heard. And there's a recent body of literature on the relationship between this historic pattern of redlining and neighborhood environments. including, for example, on exposure to PM 2.5 and health outcomes. So that's a background for why this is so critical and why today we need to take up this call. And of course, as you've heard, and I won't spend a lot of time on it, Executive Order 12898 is still a guiding mandate. And we do have the obligation to consider and address disproportionate impacts on the basis of race and color, national origin, and income in our programs and activities. And I can tell you, we're taking this up with renewed vigor in revisiting how we're integrating EO 12898 obligations in permitting, in rulemaking, in oversight, in licensing, and all our activities. In addition, as you've heard, in his first days of office, the president issued 2 more executive orders. And I won't spend a lot of time on 14008, as Quentin already discussed it. But one piece I want to just elevate is this piece about moving, the Environmental Protection Agency is still, we have so much experience and we're still a locus, a source of energy, a source of policy, a source of materials, a source for assistance and partnership with our sister agencies. But there's something about the White House lifting this up and being another locus of activities to lead agencies. And I am just seeing such a level of excitement in our sister agencies in working together with the White House to move this forward. So among other things, 14008, as Quentin said, situated the WEJAC and the Interagency Council in the White House. It established Justice 40 to hold the federal government accountable for directing 40% of the benefits of a large swath of federal investments to disadvantaged communities. That is, to direct the funding to communities most in need. And we've been implementing that across the board, hitting targets, and we expect to more than account for 40% of those investments in disadvantaged communities. The creation of a climate environmental justice screening tool at the White House. But I would note, EJ Screen has been available at EPA. It's a really important screening tool. Health and Human Services also has a screening tool with an index that's available. So there's a growth of, at the federal level, different tools that are available. And there's an EJ scorecard to hold agencies accountable for delivering benefits and more. There's also Executive Order 13985, which is looks at equity. Now, historically, the term equity was in disfavor in EJ communities because it was seen as sort of taking the place of environmental racism. But it has a different meaning in Executive Order 13985 and actually calls out systematic denials of the full opportunity to participate in aspects of economic, social, and civil life. So equity is the consistent and systematic, fair, just, and impartial treatment of all individuals, including those who have been denied such treatment in underserved communities because they've systematically been denied that opportunity. And that includes Black, Latino, and Indigenous and Native American persons, Asian American Pacific Islanders, members of religious minorities, LGBTQ+ persons, people with disabilities, people who live in rural areas, and otherwise people who are affected by persistent poverty. So it's a broad swath. And I will say, in addition to what we've already talked about as a panel, the fact that people of color, Indigenous people, and low-income people are at the front line. People with disabilities are also at the front line and have significant disabilities, and of course, significant vulnerabilities when it comes to climate change in a whole swath of ways. And of course, there's tremendous intersectionality. Well, Executive Order 13985 required every agency to come up with an agency equity plan. And more recently, there's another executive order, 14091, which says this is not a one-off exercise. You don't just do this once, you integrate it into your strategic plan, into your budget. And so there's 14091 that says every year you have to have an equity action plan, and you have to have a stand-up an equity task force, and you have to staff it. At EPA, we have an equity action plan, and all agencies' equity action plans are available online. We committed to developing and implementing a cumulative impacts framework, building the capacity of EJ communities, strengthening our own capacity to engage communities, strengthening our civil rights program, integrating community science into our research, and making procurement and contracting more equitable. And I can tell you, we're making progress on each one of those, and we have measurables that we hold ourselves accountable. How do we do this? Well, I'm going to go through really quickly because I know I don't have time. But coming in to office, Administrator Regan had a directive from April 2021 saying our mission, this is integral to our mission to protect the human health and the environment of all people. And we must integrate this work, environmental justice and equity, in all that we do. It's in our strategic plan. And so those things I just talked about in our equity action plan are in our strategic plan. From the outside, I didn't know why that would be important, but we hold ourselves accountable for the things that are in our strategic plan. We have measurables. And so all of these pieces are in our strategic plan. We have, I hope all of you, in terms of other resources to be that are available, have seen the new legal tools, the updated legal tools that our Office of General Counsel came out with. This explores, it's about 200 pages plus, it explores our authorities to advance environmental justice, and we have an addendum to the legal tools document, all online, again, suggested reading, all online, that looks at our authority to consider and address cumulative impacts. The Office of Enforcement and Compliance Assurance has 4 memos outlining how they're integrating environmental justice in their work. The administrator went on a number of journeys to justice and listened. You've heard about the importance of listening, listened to communities, met with them one-on-one, and then came back and told us, integrate this into our work, and we're doing that. He sent a letter early on in the administration to the city of Chicago when a facility was closed in the white area in northern Chicago, and the plan was to permit and reopen this facility, a new facility with different characteristics, but to open this facility in an already overburdened. And he said to Lori Lightfoot, the mayor, take a pause and do a health impact assessment. We'll provide some technical assistance on that. And we did. And after that, based on a number of factors, the mayor decided not to permit that facility. So real impacts on the ground. We've launched, through the administrator's leadership, the new Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights. I'm happy to, I know I'm just cruising through because of time, but I'm happy to talk more about any of this as we get into Q&A. But the administrator went to Warren County to honor the community members who had marched for 6 weeks and were jailed fighting against environmental racism, as Charles suggested. So we know we stand on the shoulders of all of those who marched and laid their bodies on the line and who continue to do so. That reorganization lifted up environmental justice and civil rights, taking it from the margins to the center of what we do, and brought together our Office of Environmental Justice, which now is not called that. We have an Office of Community Support and an Office of Programs and Partnerships, and it brought it together with our external civil rights and conflict resolution. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the unprecedented levels of funding. Among other things, we have just are launching our TICTACs, the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Centers, which are a response to the request for many, many years from communities to help them build capacity by providing technical assistance to navigate the federal government. And we have other competitions that are live for millions of dollars that are online. Please take a look. And of course, I hope we have time to talk about our efforts to strengthen civil rights. We're increasing capacity of our civil rights program, recognizing this connection, this nexus between these intentional segregation and where we are today. And I'll talk about that later. So you can tell I'm very excited about what we're doing. It's all hands on deck. It's together with other agencies, and it's across the agency. So thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, so now we will move into the Q&A session a little bit, and we've got some questions here primed, but if you have questions from the audience, I've gotten a few cards already, please write them down for us. We'd be happy to repeat them into the mic. I also do want to say a little bit of a disclaimer, however, and this comes out of my prior service in the government. We know that there may be various communities that have matters or cases that are actively before the agency. And so in those particular matters, our government folks will not be able to speak specifically to an outcome or pre-decision in a case, just like I now in private practice would not be able to speak about anything that relates to any of one of my firm's clients' matters. So that is the one caveat that to our questions, but let's get started with one that I have here. The question came in that we were talking about opportunities to advance issues of environmental justice. And we've talked about where good work has already taken place, some success stories. The question is, where do you see the untapped opportunities to advance environmental justice? So I'll open that up to anybody. The untapped opportunity.
I wouldn't say it's necessarily an untapped opportunity, but it's one that we do not uplift enough, and that is this future generation. I have a number of Gen Zers on my team, and these young people are phenomenal to many of the reasons that Quentin laid out. And so I think that one tremendous untapped opportunity is to, one, harness that energy and really help push this work forward, but also to take a few steps back and to really develop rigorous education in middle school programs, middle school science programs around environmental justice. I think that is a gaping hole here because a lot of people don't discover this or fall into this until they get to college. And by that point, there's, a real missed opportunity. And I think it's really important to begin to start educating our youth and uplifting the voices of those youth who are standing out in front today.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
Okay, terrific, thanks. So untapped is a hard word because I really do believe we build on the work of those who came before us. But I think there are a number of key ideas and starting points that have been building for a long time, but they also represent untapped potential. So both Charles and I mentioned the need to consider and address cumulative impacts, the multiple layers, multiple factors that affect outcomes in all kinds of circumstances, and the fact that some communities are not only feeling the effects of one facility, but multiple facilities, as well as lower health status, high asthma rates, high cancer rates that pre-exist. That's the cumulative impacts of new pollutants and also layers and layers of stressors. So that is an area where there is so much going on right now, not only at the federal government, but at state governments and in local governments. So we're building on what came before. And I mentioned the legal tools document and the cumulative impacts addendum to legal tools. So the addendum lays out areas where we have authority. And that's not new, but we've laid it out in, I hope, a clearer way. And we need to talk more about what's happening at the local and state level. This is not only a federal government issue. So states for years, almost every state has an EJ law, an EJ office, or an EJ policy, or an EJ directive, but many of them were procedural. And now we have a new generation of state EJ laws that call on the state to create methodologies for considering cumulative impacts in permitting. And so Colorado, New Jersey, New York has a variation, Minnesota has long had a variation, are just some examples, and they're all slightly different from each other. But what is going on in states in this sort of next generation of EJ laws, mapping and in sort of an iterative way with Charles, who's been a leader on this, and the federal government, is fantastic. So cumulative impacts is one area, integrating cumulative impacts in permitting, advisory groups. We've had the NEJAC for years. There's the WEJAC we've talked about, but a lot of states now have EJ and climate justice advisory groups. So all of these have their forerunners, but there is so much happening. And in terms of next steps, really understanding what's happening at local, state levels, not just federal levels, and getting involved. This is a moment to shape it and to make sure that it is addressing these very critical issues. And I just want to add to our reading list that Margot started. I would make sure that the starting point is the principles of environmental justice that that Charles, that came out of the summit that Charles mentioned, the 17 principles of environmental justice. And again, it's not that they're new, but it is not fully tapped to adhere to those principles of self-determination and respect for all. And I would also add the DOJ Title VI legal manual. Not new, it was updated during the Obama administration, but as we think about how to integrate civil rights in all that we do, to really see and honor and pay attention to those resources that are available and recognize as we bring this new level of vigor to doing this work, that there are resources that can be helpful in moving this forward. Thanks.
That in the way of education. First of all, number one, you want to know about environmental justice? Go online. There's so much material online. Before reading Charles's magnificent work on toxic waste and rates, there was very little. Now it's just a plethora of information. Secondly, working with the task force for the ABA, I would like to see that the environmental justice is mandatory in law schools. At the very least, I'm hoping to encourage the task force to recommend that law schools included in the curriculum. Thirdly, we found in the course we teach environmental justice and also civil rights and environmental law. And we have our students every week, they have to go out and find an article in the media, general media, online, and bring it in and be able to show there's an environmental justice community and they have issues and how they are being addressed or what laws can be and should be used to do so. And they have to defend that position. They find out that that's not quite that easy, the last part of that. But for instance, like, all right, got 9 students writing this seminar, 10 weeks of courses. That means what? It's almost 100 articles in a semester that they've been exposed to. And I say to them, did you read anything about environmental justice before taking this course? No. Because why? I didn't see it. I didn't think it was important. Now, some of them got kids at home making them read environmental justice articles in the news. Once you become exposed to it, you can't get away from it. You just can't get away from it. So I agree with the middle school and the high school, and that's nice. But right now we're working on the next generation. I always point to my students and say, you see all this gray hair? I'm out of here. It's all on you. Whatever happens is your fault. Because we want them to get out here and take over this work. And there's plenty of work, and there are plenty of young people that want to do it.
Yeah. You got another question here in the room?
Yeah. How do you balance environmental concerns and concerns about environmental justice with the need to create more housing? I saw a study that said that 50% of the housing projects in California in 2021 were challenged on environmental issues. I think that affordable housing is definitely a clear and present danger. It affects everything from education to environmental issues. So how do you balance protecting the environment, protecting people from pollutions and stuff like that, but also continuing to build enough housing that we need?
Sure. Somebody want to take that in terms of the balance, and even if you think about it from the when I hear the question, I also think about it from the bigger perspective. How do you foster the growth that's needed, smart growth, important socially conscious growth, in a way that still honors the environmental protections and particularly the communities around?
Well, just quickly, I want to attack the premise that about the balance. I mean, environmental justice covers housing. Environmental justice is cross-cutting. Environmental justice is economic justice, is housing justice, is criminal justice, medical justice, etc. Now, there are aspects of housing. I mean, you can break down any of these into certain, details that you want to segregate them out. But Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is the principal tool that, I teach, and Dingwick Marion really is the expert on this. But, where there are violations of fair housing, redlining, anything to do with housing. But that's where I would start is, and you should see the number of cases in the media about fair housing and Title VI that are in play now. But I'll stop there and let someone else talk.
My take on that would be, I don't know, starting where Quentin was talking about, it's a larger question than just housing versus environment. And I think about, when you raise the question, I think about how do you deal with displacement and gentrification, which I think has been a real thorny policy issue. And I think the best thinking on that is that you have to have everyone, all the communities that are impacted, be part of the conversation. And the more you can do that, the more you're able to start to address those issues. But underneath those are, of course, really difficult policy issues and choices. And not to say that that is a panacea, but that is definitely a prerequisite to getting anything really authentic and any authentic kind of solution.
Other questions in the room? We have one here.
Yes, my question will be maybe to both EPA and DOJ. What are the challenges of litigating this type of cases? Because I know that they have a whole lot of,
Come take the class.
yeah, or some of the most important challenges of litigating this type of cases.
What's the question again, though, please?
What are the challenges of litigating this type of cases from the government side, right? The Department of Justice and the environmental, because I know that there's a whole other type of litigator, administrative.
I can start, and then Quentin can jump in with the real litigation piece, if that makes sense.
And then I'll throw in my private sector hat to you.
Excellent. So at EPA, first of all, there are two sets of enforcement activities that might come under the rubric of these types of cases. One would be under OECA, right? The environmental enforcement, which is done together with DOJ, and Quentin will talk more about that. And the other is the civil rights enforcement. And the civil rights enforcement is at EPA is administrative rather than litigation. There is, if we make findings of discrimination, we can refer those cases to DOJ for litigation. And of course, private litigants can go to court if they have a claim of intentional discrimination. And there's a whole conversation that could be had about the challenges of bringing intentional discrimination cases under an array of statutes, not only Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, but also Title VIII, which is the fair housing law. So that's a whole body of law that is applicable as well. But at EPA, some of the challenges we've had to administrative enforcement of civil rights is we haven't had capacity. For years and years, we had 12 people and to do civil rights enforcement across the whole nation. And we raised that over the last year to having authority to have 16, and next year we'll inch over 20. But it is, the Department of Education in the education sector or transportation or ag, they have hundreds, and we have, 20. So we can talk more about how we're using that 20 to make a difference. We have to change the culture. One thing that happened is that EPA came about after 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed, and we never really developed a culture in this sector of recognizing the authority of the civil rights law in agency regulation. So we're still trying to turn that around, and we're doing a lot on training and technical assistance. We are trying to go from a reactive to proactive stance. That historically one of the challenges has been that complaints come in, and then we review them, and then they take all of our capacity. And how do we actually make sure more systemically that we're changing compliance across the environmental sector and raising awareness? Not so we can, the remedy here is to withdraw federal funds, not so we can withdraw federal funds. Of course, we're willing to do that in egregious cases, but so we can get compliance with the civil rights law. And so we're taking a number of steps to use our affirmative authority. And engaging complainants. Another challenge has been that in the administrative process, once someone filed a case, this is not just true at EPA, but across the federal government, this was more like a DA taking a case, and having conversations or pursuing their investigation. And we're trying to innovate with new ways to engage complainants. So those are some of the challenges we face that we're trying to overcome. We're really excited about our steps, but they are real challenges.
Well, I would say the first challenge is money. More money, more money, more money. What's needed to do these cases takes a lot. Second is talent, that is finding lawyers who have the kind of experience you need to do them. Now, EPA, for instance, and the Office of Civil Rights particularly was under a lot of gun for many years because you have under Title VI of the Civil Rights Act 1964, you can write really on the back of a napkin, just to say, company XYZ is spewing filth in my community, my children are dying, I want you to investigate it, because the state should never have given them permit. I'm just making something up. And then EPA is supposed to take a look at that and investigate it and all, but it takes a lot of resources to do that. So there were a number of cases. In fact, there were, Marion probably can do better than that. There was 5 cases that wind up in the California Southern District. Anyway, the court basically took a look at it and said, "How come you have 180 days to make a decision on whether or not you're going to take the case and investigate?" And some there was as late as 40 years had gone by. Okay, 20 years was not uncommon. And there were a host of reasons, but basically they didn't have the staff nor the political support to go to do that. And the judge made them, go back and do all those cases again in terms of just the investigation to come to a decision. Yes, we will investigate. No, we won't. And here's reasons why. It is only now that they're getting the EPA is getting the muscle and the money to do that. You go and you take a look at any of the cases that have been filed, like Earth Justice, or those that, well, even that Marianne used to file when she was in private practice. Title VI, Sierra Club, NAACP. You look at the administrative complaints filed with EPA. They are great pieces of legal writing. And you look at that, I show my students, I said, you see this only took this particular case 50 pages. That's far cry from just writing on the back of a napkin. But they lay out what the problem is, what they think. Here's the research, here's the law, here are the facts. It was a blueprint for EPA. But EPA didn't have the resources. I went back over on another detail to work out of the administrator's office, particularly on Title VI as well as environmental justice. And I mean, I saw the few people that office had to work on stuff, and they were being burnt out. They were frustrated, and they were doing the best they could. But it was hard to get cases, to get the agency to actually file. Now the pressure's on. Now they've got people like Mary Ann and others who want to do this work because it ain't easy, but they're up to the challenge. But that's only a recent development. And as much as, EPA was my client, and I got things to say about EPA and what they didn't do or should have done, but also I'm very empathetic to the people that work at EPA, the grunts, the managers, the people that had the responsibility, wanted to make this stuff work. But there's this thing called Congress, and there's this thing called politics, and then back to this thing that I call money. And just because it's a very worthwhile mission, if you don't give them the equipment and the tools, are that enough challenges for you?
Well, and I'm looking at the clock. I see we only have about 3 minutes left, but I do want to just offer, if I were to put on my private sector hat, one of the biggest challenges, or that you will hear from the regulated industry, is there's no law requiring a company to consider Egypt. I think the closest thing you get is the NEPA laws that require engagement of the community, but they don't go so far as to say that that community's voice needs to be heeded in the ultimate decision. And so if you have a company that, for whatever reason, has not noticed the groundswell of support or not driven by either corporate social responsibility or other moral-like obligations, and they want to kind of stick to their guns, you could still aggressively prosecute under all of the other environmental statutes, but to get the specific remedy for the community, that's where I think the government has to be creative. And I see that I'm starting to get the hook from Juan here. But please join me in thanking our panelists. We could have talked about this literally all day. And so we're very grateful for allowing us to share this morning with you.
Gwen, not only for being our moderator, but she's also one of our sponsors. So thank you, Gwen, for being a sponsor of our conference. Thank you, panelists. Give them one more round of applause, please.